Good afternoon and welcome to the Academy from ancient Greece. I've decided to pass over the feedback to Aristotle and wind back to about 350 BC. At that time, he would have been a student in Plato's Academy in Athens, and they'd have been listening to birdsong and wearing funny robes and probably wearing little sort of shoes, plugger things. So, um, By the way, he went on to set up his own school, and it was to do with things like logic and philosophy and morals, but also rhetoric, the study of how to persuade people. One of the favorite ones that you looked at this week was by this person, Luciane Valkovich, and she, of course, has a good way of establishing her own credibility. Her specialist area is to look at the um, habitability of planets, particularly Mars, and she offers an extended comparison between Mars and perhaps the most habitable looking deserts on Mars and some of the worst places on Earth. And this extended comparison shows that the ones on Earth are much better and much more worth investing our time in. And this kind of model is called an extended comparison. And with any comparison, just like mathematical modeling, we've got to ask the question, how useful is it? How appropriate is it? Of course, every model to some extent doesn't fit the reality, so some critical evaluation is needed. Just by the way, there's an obvious logos or logic rippling through her speech, and you've got to like the way at the end that she delivers her conclusion with real resonance and says, therefore, it's much more worth our while investing in earthly desert spaces than trying to colonize Mars or a similar planet. And it's almost as if she says at the end, QED. If you like that one and want to follow up, there's a really good Stephen Miles TED talk, Where Are All the Aliens? And in a similar way, he does something a bit unusual and comes to the conclusion at the end in a way that's quite surprising and a little bit upside down from the usual structure that we teach. One kind of comparison is an analogy. It's a metaphor, really, where one thing is being thought of in terms of another. And we probably saw that most prominently in McGarth's argument about whether acidification is the evil twin of climate change. Um, Probably the analogy doesn't fit too well when you think it through in detail, because an evil twin usually has a good twin. But anyway, I think that's probably a good example of how, with any analogy, it can be very emotive and a very powerful, persuasive tool, but we have to stop and think about it and see how far the model fits. Another example of this was, of course, DiCaprio's idea that the slavery issue of our time is climate change. And no one wants to be on the wrong side of the slavery issue. So it's a very strong argument to suggest we better be doing something about climate change. Uh, Valkovich used a more amusing one, saying that getting onto Mars to make our future cities and dwellings is a bit like the captain of the Titanic saying the true party is happening later in the lifeboats. Rhetorical questions are very powerful, and there's a lot of subtlety and shading in how they're used. Of course, Barack Obama's one is probably not so much rhetorical as expecting a response, yes, we can, and the cry gets louder and louder. They can work really well at the beginning, like with McGarth, act as a kind of a hook. What do you know about acidification? Or do you know how much worse it is than it was even 50 years ago? Most usually they're subheadings, and we usually expect them to be answered. There's nothing wrong, nothing worse than a scattering of rhetorical questions, but you're not actually planning to answer any of them. That can be very frustrating. And sometimes, though, we do know the answer. Yes, we're meant to say we do like salmon, we do like shellfish. Ethos, pathos, logos. These are the fundamentals of rhetoric as named all the way back by Aristotle, but they're not discrete and separate. They work really well when interwoven, perhaps like all the primary colours, which is an analogy. For instance, I think once Lucienne has established her credibility, then she offers a really powerful personification of the earth that probably reminds us of Pope Francis talking about our common home sagging under the weight of our misbehaviour. Credibility is often aided by some language choice. You want your sentences to be short, sharp, clear when you're delivering the facts. And of course, you have the option with your multimodals to use slides effectively, as McGrath does sometimes. I think in the Gruen transfer, they looked at a study once of the impact of a baby emotionally on the human brain. And of course, there are parts of your brain to do with core emotion that go crazy when you see pictures of babies and puppies. So if they really are stakeholders, bring them in, because it'll be an effective pathos appeal. Sentence structures are getting into the nitty gritty, but there are some I think we've seen so far that work really well. The balance in Martin Luther King's famous not wanting his children to be judged by the colour of their skin, but by the content of their character. You'll notice the equality on one side of the equation with the other, and obviously the second part should be replacing the first. In the second case that I've picked, it's an if-then statement. And as I've said before, in Lucienne, there's a real logic to her answer, to her arguments. One of the most powerful arguments that human beings can use in projecting forward is to use an if-then structure. Because we don't always know what's going to happen down the track. For instance, the COVID environment's changing very rapidly. So we posit that if one state of affairs will happen, then another will follow. And Afro we've seen quite a lot. I have a dream, let the bells of freedom ring in all the parts of the southern states of America. It creates this kind of wave effect of building to a powerful conclusion. With short, punchy sentences, they also have this effect of explaining complex processes in lay person's terms, something I think that McGrath and Lucian Valkovich do so well, and it's probably one of the secrets of TED Talks. And to my mind, it's borrowing something from a great physicist called Richard Feynman, who had a wonderful method of bringing science right up to what any person can touch, see, taste, smell, think about, worry about in day-to-day life. And that capacity to bring things that might seem complex right back to your field of vision is a very powerful rhetorical strategy. There are some tonal shifts. You don't want to sound like an expert the whole time, and particularly if you are a scientist. So I've given an example of that taking place. The law of excluded middle is a logical truth, and it can be applied very powerfully in arguments sometimes. It's really simply to state that there are times when only one of two things can be true. Either it is the case that climate change is man-made and that we can reverse it, or it isn't the case. And as soon as you express something that sharply, you can really invite your listeners to get off the fence and take one position or another. So you can see how powerfully that's working in the DiCaprio and the Valkovich speeches.